Someone once wrote this about our rivers. If we look closely and deeply enough, we can often see who we are as a people. Rivers define the context that gives us our sense of community. They link us to our history, our heritage, and the landscapes which have ultimately helped to shape our values and our character as individuals and as a nation. St. Louis is one of those cities shaped by its rivers. Today it is a vibrant city with major corporations, world-class entertainment, an affordable cost of living, and so many other Midwestern amenities that make the St. Louis area an extraordinary place to call home. But its history is rooted clearly in one thing: the river that meanders slowly through the center of the region. History shows the region was first occupied by a people called mound builders, and by the 1500s and 1600s, European explorers began to find their way into the wilderness of the area. Historians estimate a little more than 1 million people inhabited the land. The 1700s saw more explorers arriving from Europe. The French and the Spanish were first, but the British soon joined in, all vying for part of what was becoming a highly profitable fur trade. Everyone knew that whoever controlled the trade controlled the money. The key to success was the river. The year was 1763, when a French fur trapper named Pierre Laclede journeyed from New Orleans into what was then called the Illinois country. His purpose was to open a trading post. He picked a site on the west bank of the Mississippi, between the Missouri River on the north and the River de Pere on the south. He called it St. Louis, honoring the King of France, the nation's patron saint. As the nation grew and ultimately fought its battle for independence and established its new democratic system of government, St. Louis was growing too. The country's rapid westward expansion was giving rise to a new understanding of what the city was becoming, the gateway to the West. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 saw France and Spain turn over control of all the land west of the Mississippi. In a grand ceremony held on the riverfront on the land now beneath the Gateway Arch, the three countries handed off their flags. First, Spain to France, then the final handoff, France to the United States. That one moment opened this gateway to the West even wider. Traders, trappers, and explorers used St. Louis as the jumping-off point into an unknown wilderness of opportunity to the west. Among the more famous was Meriwether Lewis and William Clark's trailblazing expedition, departing from St. Louis on May 14, 1804. In a span of 28 months, they covered 8,000 miles, journeying to the Pacific Ocean and back again. Easterners came looking for adventure, jobs, and new beginnings, making the area one of the fastest growing in the nation. At one point, St. Louis was the second largest city in the country, second only to Pittsburgh. The river would now become more important than ever. A new industry to transport goods was taking shape. Entrepreneurs used flatboats and keelboats to move cargo and supplies up and down the river. It was a slow and tedious process. The mighty keelmen had to pull their way up and down the river, through and around snags and log jams. Against a fast-running river, trips would often take many days and more often than not, weeks to move cargo from one major city to another. The river industry changed quickly, however, with the advent of steam. The first steamboat arrived in St. Louis in 1817. The Zebulon M. Pike was a small boat. It traveled only during daylight hours and also used a poling crew to push her along. It marked the beginning of the steamboat era and galvanized the shipping industry. Steamboats were new, and more importantly, they were much faster, cutting days and even weeks off of some schedules to deliver goods along the river. The levee was always filled with cargo to be shipped, everything from coffee to cotton. River traffic, once limited to moving cargo, now became accessible to people. The wealthy, in particular, now demanded time and accommodations on the river. This period of time became what was known as the Golden Age of river traffic. Some of the finer steamboats were described by one account as floating palaces, luxuriously appointed and decorated inside and out. At the height of the steamboat era, the levee along the St. Louis riverbank extended for 6 miles. One account reports as many as 170 steamboats anchored and moored along the St. Louis riverfront. Each had its own distinctive mark.
Could be heard scream for 12 or 15 miles on a clear night, while others had a heavy, deep sound or growl. The Hannibal, a big New Orleans boat, being of the latter kind. The average life of a boat was about 5 years. After that, they were either torn up to build a more modern boat, or it sunk or blown up. Need I tell you that in one bend of the river, there lie the wrecks of 103 steamboats between St. Louis and Cairo.
Steamboats were not without their problems. The year 1849 saw a boat called the White Cloud destroyed by fire. That blaze also destroyed 23 other steamboats along the levee and 20 blocks of buildings and warehouses in the now thriving city of St. Louis. In the 1860s, as the Civil War divided the nation, river traffic from the south was essentially halted, hitting local businesses especially hard. The war limited industrial growth, and as such, progress began to wane, opening the door for cities to the north like Chicago to become bigger and more important on the nation's emerging landscape. As steamboat builders competed to construct the best steamboat on the river, they also competed to see which boat was the fastest. In 1843, the J.M. White was built and deemed as the fastest ever. It made the trip upriver from New Orleans to St. Louis in 3 days, 23 hours, and 9 minutes. For that time, an illustrious record that stood for several decades. It would be nearly 30 years later, in 1870, when 2 steamboats would race to St. Louis, that the record would be broken. An estimated crowd of 10,000 crammed around the start line in New Orleans to see the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee begin the 1,200-mile trek north. Reports say the Robert E. Lee arrived in St. Louis late in the morning of July 4, 1870, 3 days, 18 hours, and 13 minutes after it left New Orleans. Because of some reported fog around Cairo, Illinois, and having to stop for some coal, the Natchez rolled into St. Louis 6.5 hours later. It was this riverboat race that also marked the beginning of a distinctive St. Louis tradition, the July 4th Veiled Prophet Parade and festivities, which continue today to be a regional mainstay. During the steamboat era, travel by land also began to take on added significance. Stagecoach lines from the east ended in St. Louis. Later, the city became a starting point for trails west, most notably the Santa Fe and the National Trails. The discovery of gold in 1849 in California made the city the outfitting point for many wagon trains heading west. The railroads also saw St. Louis as a vital city to the development of that industry. The river, however, was an obstacle. For the railroads to head west, there needed to be a way over the river. A man named James B. Eads, known more for his talents as a builder of ironclad warships, was commissioned to lead a team to build a bridge to span the Mississippi. It was a remarkable engineering feat for the late 1800s. This one bridge over this one river opened the way for railroads to become the preferred choice of transportation from coast to coast. Walt Whitman once wrote, "I have haunted the river every night lately, where I could get a good look at the bridge by moonlight. It is indeed a structure of perfection and beauty unsurpassable, and I never tire of it." The river didn't always run true. At one point in the early 1800s, the Mississippi ran by the city of St. Louis really as 2 rivers, 2 equally sized tributaries divided by an island sandbar. The island would eventually become densely forested and become known by the locals as Bloody Island. Bloody Island became a site for dueling. Being in the middle of the river, the land was controlled neither by Missouri nor Illinois, both of which had outlawed dueling. So the island became the site of choice for angry men looking to settle their differences. Among the most famous duels, Thomas Hart Benton and Charles Lucas in 1817. Lucas had accused Benton of not paying his property taxes. Benton was said to have boasted at one time,
"Nobody opposes Benton, sir. Nobody but a few blackjack prairie lawyers. I never quarrel, sir, but I do fight, sir. And when I fight, sir, a funeral follows, sir."
At 30 feet, Lucas was shot in the throat, Benton in the knee. They continued the duel, this time at much closer range, only 10 feet from one another. Lucas missed. Benton shot and killed his opponent. In addition to the violence of Bloody Island, the sandbar itself presented a menacing problem to the port of St. Louis. River navigation with large steamboats was becoming more and more difficult. In 1837, Captain Robert E. Lee of the USA Engineers devised a plan to eliminate Bloody Island. Through a system of dikes and dams, the engineers blocked the water from flowing to the Illinois side of the small island. It worked. The land known as Bloody Island eventually became part of the Illinois shoreline and opened the river channel as we know it today. The Mississippi River is a little more than 2,500 miles in length, 2,552 to be exact. From its trickle-like headwaters in Minnesota to its wide delta, where its rushing waters gush into the Gulf of Mexico, this river is one of our nation's most alluring landmarks. For who knows how many centuries, this river has strayed only slightly from its original main channel. Season after season, year after year, decade upon decade, the Mississippi River has made its mark on this entire region. The times change. So do the generations of people who have lived here. The city and the region have grown larger. The skyline is different today than it was 10 and 20 and 50 and 100 years ago. But our heritage is still with us. A trip to the top of the arch will give you a view only our ancestors could have dreamed of. The buildings on the landing have been restored, and decades later, if you take a moment, you can still smell a hint of the coffee beans left over in the attics of the restored warehouses, once full of cargo in the steamboat era. The old courthouse still stands today in the heart of downtown St. Louis. This the site of the famous Dred Scott case that legalized slavery and put into motion the events that would lead to our nation's bloody and violent Civil War. Today, the old courthouse is open to visitors who can imagine for themselves what it must have been like to hear Dred Scott plead for his freedom. But the river in many ways is unchanging. It just keeps on rolling, in its own way, an eyewitness, that one historical thread that winds its way throughout the fabric of our culture and what we have become today as a community in the 21st century. St. Louis, the gateway to the West, a frontier experience rooted in the Mississippi River and more than 4 centuries of pioneers. From its earliest days of trappers and traders to a high-tech metropolis brimming with innovation and creativity, St. Louis today is indeed a city of destination, the gateway to the West. We invite you to make it your destination.